recording is on, Peggy. Yes, I welcome everybody to this first presentation of already the last day of the first Thai conference. Yes. And I'm pleased to welcome our next keynote speaker of this conference, which is Peggy Mok. And I think Peggy, I met during the Sound to Sense project 2008, or perhaps even a bit earlier, or at one of, or it could even have been the first the speech prosody conference in Campinas in 2008. I'm not perfectly sure. And Peggy had her bachelor thesis in Chinese language and literature, and made her master and her PhD in linguistics from Cambridge University, UK. And since 2008, she's doing the research and the lecturing at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. From 2008 to 2013 as assistant professor, then as associate professor, and very fresh, congratulations again, from 2021 as a full professor at the Department of Linguistics and Modern Languages at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She has published over 200 publications already, among which 122 peer-reviewed journal and preceding papers that deal with a big range of different speech production and perception topics, and with different languages. Today, the keynote that we're going to hear is about the acquisition, the acquisition of lexical tone in various contexts. So the context is basically also what we have talked about so much during this conference, perhaps one of the key topics of this conference. And so I'm very happy that we also end this keynote series of the Thai with a presentation on context, with special emphasis on the acquisition of lexical tone. Peggy, the floor is yours. Thank you so much that you are giving us this keynote here this morning.
Thank you, Oliver. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Oliver and the organizing committee and Wan Tao Hu for inviting me to give me an opportunity to share my research.
Wait a second, I have to make this one unmuted.
Can you guys hear me well?
Okay.
There is a strong feedback online. I think, yeah.
Can you hear me well now?
Yeah,
can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes, good. Let me thank Oliver and the organizing committee again for inviting me, giving me this opportunity. I have a lot to share with you. I'll try my best to finish everything in 15 minutes. If you haven't done anything on speech acquisition or tone acquisition as first language, a useful starting point will be this recent paper by Zhang and Fu. They review a lot of production and perception studies on tone development. They propose that there is a distinct course of first language development of tone languages versus non-tone languages, and propose that much theoretical advancement can be reached if further research on tone acquisition is done. Nevertheless, given their background in psychology, they mainly focused on the perceptual narrowing of younger infants. They didn't really talk a lot about meaningful use of lexical tone in various contexts. There are many other interesting linguistic aspects of tone acquisition, which is fun and theoretically important to explore, but they didn't discuss. So the content of my talk, yes?
Just one thing, we can see your desktop. Is this intended?
No, it's not. I should be sharing the PowerPoint. Did you not see the PowerPoint?
We do see the PowerPoint, but also the desktop behind.
Okay, and also how strange, shouldn't be. Can you still see the desktop behind?
No, it's better now.
It's better now. Okay, just the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can go on. So there are three main parts of the of the talk today, I would like to talk to you about monolingual acquisition of lexical tones, mostly on Cantonese, a little bit on Pensan Wu on voice quality, and then bilingual acquisition of tone in Cantonese and English context, and lastly, and the most interesting part, I think, the acquisition of complex tone sandy in Salmon dialect. Okay, so monolingual acquisition of Cantonese tone. So a very brief introduction to the tone system in Cantonese. There are 6 lexical tones on unchecked syllables. So 3 level tones, tone 1, tone 3, and tone 6, and then 2 rising tones, tone 2 and tone 5, and then tone 4 as a low falling tone. There have been a number of studies showing very early production acquisition by monolingual children. So by 2 years or 2 years and 6 months, monolingual Cantonese children, they have very high accuracy in their production. Interestingly, in other languages like Mandarin and Thai, there are studies also reporting similarly early acquisition. So these studies seem to suggest that tone is acquired very early, regardless of the complexity of the tone system. However, if we look at them more closely, there are a number of issues with them. They have inconsistent criteria for acquisition, and then they either have very few participants or few data points. Mostly didn't look at acoustic data. And this last point is something that we can focus more on, because most earlier studies, they used transcription data by one judge only. They did have some data cross-check, but only a small portion. Although they have very high integrated reliability, but if you consider all data all together, that means there are still quite a lot of data with no agreement. Contrary to production studies, earlier perception studies show a much later age of acquisition in Cantonese tone development, either by 10 years old, if you are using only the 6 syllables with yi, or if you are using simpler words, more familiar words with children, then by 6 years old, their accuracy is over 90%, but still not completely adult-like. Okay, so if we pull the 2 groups of study together, production and perception, then you will see that there is a very large discrepancy in the age of acquisition between production and perception studies. Production shows that by 2 or 2.5, children have no problem in their tones production, but by 6 or even by 10, they really adult-like in their perception. So there is a very large discrepancy. So what happened during those years that they can produce tones very well, but cannot perceive them well? And such findings are against the general principle in first language acquisition that perception precedes production. There are a lot of methodological issues at hand that make the data not totally comparable. In addition to that, production people, they work on production, perception people, they work on perception. So the data are from different children, making it hard for us to assess whether there is a link in first language acquisition of tones. Recently, a colleague in Hong Kong, Wang, did a series of studies on both Cantonese and Mandarin tone acquisition. She showed that there is a much more protracted process of Cantonese tones acquisition. She used a very stringent criteria. Unlike previous studies, only having one judge listening to the materials, she had multiple judges. For the Cantonese project, she used 5, and for the Mandarin, she used even 10 judges. In addition to that, she low pass filter all the materials for transcription, removing contextual information. She showed that children's tone production accuracy is still not adult-like even at 6 years old, which is not surprising using such a stringent criterion. However, her findings are not comparable with previous studies because they are just too different in terms of how they conduct their research. In addition, she only had a little bit of acoustic data of 20 children at 3 years old. So let's have a quick look at her data. She grouped the data in adult correct, adult incorrect, and children, adult correct, children correct, and children incorrect. We can see in her data that True correct production are actually very much adult-like. For incorrect production, the pitch range is very narrow and a lot of the contour shapes may not be canonical. She had this summary table of all of her acoustic data. She had 6 acoustic measurements for all tones. And then we don't need to go into the detail, but the point here being her comparison is showing that whether adult correct production and child correct production are not the same, whether there is any significant difference between them. So we can see that adult luckiness being the criterion defining successful acquisition in her study and a lot of other previous studies as well. I had a project revisiting Cantonese tone acquisition. There are a number of research questions I would like to ask. The first one being whether there is a production perception link in the data. Wong didn't find any link at age 3, but a weak link considering a wider age range from 4 to 6. I also look at family background effects on tone acquisition, but in this talk, I don't have time to talk about that. I look at quite a lot of acoustic data. Unlike Wong having the same measurements for all tones, I focus on meaningful contrast among similar tone pairs. And finally, a very important question when we work with Truden, work on phonological acquisition, how to define successful phonological acquisition. Is adult luckiness in all aspects, in actual values, necessary? So I have one big project, but because I had to work in phases, so the production perception link data, I have these numbers of Truden in 6 months age bands. And then I also have some reference speakers. And for the acoustic patterns, I have more Truden. So the production task was a simple picture naming task. We used a standardized test and we added more words for tones. So for 6 tones in Cantonese, we have 5 words for each tone and 2 repetitions. Compared to earlier studies, we have more data. We use transcription and acoustic measurement. But for the link study, we first base our data on transcription. So we have 3 phonetically trained native speakers. So one, the judge A, seeing through the whole project, and then there's a change of research personnel, and that's why B and C are considered one person here. Following Wong, we low pass filter our materials as well. So our judges listening to the materials unfiltered and filtered. They did the transcription independently. So the accuracy conditions or judgment conditions, there are 4 of them, depending on 2 factors, whether the materials are filtered or not, whether one judge identifying the intended tone, and that's correct, or we have to have both judges agreeing on the tone, considering it correct. So there are 4 conditions. Most lenient being with using unfiltered material, just one judge judgment. So that's similar to earlier studies. And then the most stringent criterion here, using filtered material, but both judges must agree on the tone before we consider it correct. So for the perception study, we also use a standardized test, but we simplify it, removing some of the distractors. So giving them the children 2 pictures, and then they heard a production of it, and they had to decide which one is the correct one. So let's have a quick look at the results. We have quite high reliability between the 2 judges, so comparable to earlier studies. For filtered material, you can see that even for reference speakers, the reliability is lower. A summary of the results would be accuracy still not on par with reference speakers by 6 for both production and perception, and then we will look at them one by one. Okay, let's have a quick look at the production accuracy. Now, so we have unfiltered, filtered, and then 1 judge or 2 judges like that, and the age groups are here. If we look at the reference speakers, unfiltered 1 judge, they are at ceiling. Even with 2 judges, very high accuracy. That's what we expect because they are the reference speakers and they were screened for their production accuracy. If we look at filtered material with 1 judge, still not too bad. but with 2 judges, even for reference speakers, the accuracy was much lower. If we look at children data, then the most lenient condition, you see high accuracy, similar to earlier studies showing that by 2 or 2.5, children have very high accuracy. But if you look at the filter conditions, significantly lower production accuracy, and if we have 2 judges, then you don't really see any meaningful improvement. The accuracy rates are hovering about 40 to 50. That is quite unlike in other conditions. You see small and gradual improvement in the production accuracy. Okay, then if we look at the individual tones, again, the 4 conditions, whether it's filter, unfiltered, 1 or 2 judges, the 6 individual tones. Let's look at the most lenient one. You see that early on, most tones, they are at ceiling already, except tone 5. If we look at this one, unfiltered with 2 judges, then obviously the accuracy rates are down. They are not really at ceiling for many of the tones. With filtered material, 1 judge, then some tones are affected more than others, because if you look at the unfiltered material, you don't see tone 3 being too affected. But here, obviously, tone 3, the accuracy rates are much lower. And not just for tone 3, even tone 1, which is a level tone, a high level tone, you also see lower accuracy. And in the most stringent criterion, filter material with 2 judges, this is very obvious. Tone 1, tone 3, and tone 6 are affected more than the other tones. So filtering has an uneven effect on the judge's perception, which may not have anything to do with the children's production, because it's the same set of material, but how we judge them to be correct or incorrect. So perception accuracy, the chance is 50%, just 2 pictures, choosing either one. We can see that the youngest age group already have higher than chance accuracy. And for reference speakers, they're at ceiling. If we look at individual tones and then the separate age groups, we see a very steady improvement. Tone 1, we see a ceiling effect earlier on, but for other tones, this is a very nice picture showing how perceptual acuity improves gradually with age. Now, just now, this figure shows you individual data for each 6 months age band. Here, I group them together. So, yearly age band. For visual clarity, you see 3 big dips in the perceptual accuracy. For tone 2, tone 5, the 2 rising tones, tone 3, tone 6, the 2 level tones, and then tone 4, tone 6, the low tones. Now, these 3 tone pairs are reported to be difficult and they're merging among adult speakers. So it's not surprising we see the big dips there. But what is interesting is you see very obvious improvement in the perception accuracy between 2 years old and then 3-year-old. 3-year-old to 4-year-old, but then after that, you don't really see a lot of improvement in the perception accuracy. Such patterns are also seen for the merging pairs. There's a much bigger improvement here, but then after that, not much. And also interestingly, before that, also not much improvement. So we can see there seems to be a watershed of the accuracy in terms of tone perception, much more significant improvement or obvious improvement when they are younger. And after reaching age 4, they can still improve a bit, but the improvement is a lot more minor than when earlier on. So we see nonlinear development of their perceptual ability. Okay, now we pull the 2 sets of data together to see whether there is a link between production and perception. Here you have age correlating with production accuracy. We have significant correlation in all 4 judgment conditions. The best one being this unfiltered 2 judges. And if we take perception accuracy, the correlation is even better. A very significant correlation between age and perception accuracy. So it seems to suggest that you don't really need to do anything, just grow old, then you can improve in your tone production and perception. Now, the crucial question is whether perception accuracy can account for production accuracy. We have significant correlations in all 4 judgment conditions. The best case, again, being using unfiltered material with 2 judges. However, the R square is only 0.21. So that means there are still a lot of variance in the data not explained by perception accuracy alone. Okay, as interim summary, so tones in terms of production and perception, they're still not fully acquired by age 6, but my data and also Wang data closing the gap between earlier production and perception studies. It's not that children are perfect in their production, in the tone production by 2 and 2.5. Both type of abilities they develop along with age. I found a weak production perception link. So tone perception accuracy can, to some extent, predict tone production accuracy, but still a lot of variance not explained. Mother's native language can explain some, but very small effects. And a very important point I would like to stress is that we should use vigorous but not overly stringent judgment criteria. Filtering is not helpful in actually distorting the data. Of course, just having one judge is too linear, so we should have multiple judges. But if you have many judges, then the accuracy will be much lower. So 2 or 3 would be a reasonable number. Okay, let's have a quick look at the acoustic patterns. I use the same production data, but based on unfiltered 2-judge condition. So the reference speakers, their patterns are what you expect, like the figure you saw earlier, 3 level tones, 2 rising tone and 1 falling tone. For the children's correct production, you see similar patterns. There seems to be a wider pitch span for younger children. But apart from that, the patterns all look normal. If we look at children's incorrect productions, then we see a very narrow pitch span and also something unexpected, because tone 2 would be the rising tone, the high rising tone. In many of the incorrect production, you see tone 5 being the higher rising tone. So these are something quite interesting in the incorrect productions. If we look at the production accuracy more closely, we divide the children into 3 performance groups. So top, middle, and bottom performance. Then we can see, again, steady improvement in terms of age. But interestingly, the oldest age group, there's still 1/3 of the children not reaching 90%. And for the second oldest group, 2/3 of the children not reaching 90%. So we cannot just look at a mean accuracy rate. We should really look at individual children, how they perform. Okay, earlier I mentioned that I'm interested in looking at meaningful contrast. So we track the F0 contours. For the 3 level tones, we compare their relative mean F0 heights, the ratio. So there should be a larger ratio for tone 1 versus tone 3 than tone 3 versus tone 6. For the 2 rising tones, we looked at the magnitude of rise in the second half of the syllable. In addition to that, we also looked at the inflection point, which is a covert contrast. In a minute, I will explain what it is. For the 2 low tones, we look at the magnitude of 4 and also the concomitant creakiness. So the 3 level tones, we see similar patterns for all groups, and they are all significant. So children, even the youngest age group, they could produce tone 1 farther away from tone 3 than tone 3 from tone 6. For the rising tones, Again, similar patterns, although the actual values are not the same. They have more rise for tone 2 than tone 5, and the comparisons are all significant. What is a covert contrast? A covert contrast is something that is significantly different in production, but listeners can't really hear, can't really tell. Munson and colleagues, they suggested that covert contrast, they provide very good fine-grained window into children's phonetic development. There has been no previous study looking at the rising tone. I have drawn the 2 rising tones here. There is a dip. There is a dip. And the minimum, F0 minimum of the tone 2 dip appears earlier than the tone 5 dip. It's very interesting because perceptually, listeners can't tell. I did a simple experiment with adults, but in my production data, the earlier placement of this dip is significant for the 2 tones. So we have found an interesting covert contrast in Cantonese tone contrast. So let's have a look. For the reference speakers, they have the tone 2 minimum earlier than tone 5. Significant. But then for the children's groups, you see all sorts of patterns. The older groups, they have a pattern similar to the reference speakers, but they are not significant. The only significant comparison is here. However, the pattern is reversed. They have tone 5 minimum earlier than tone 2. So we can conclude from this these data that children, they have not acquired, or they are still developing this inflection point, this covert contrast. We move to the 2 low tones. Then in terms of the magnitude of 4, they are all significant and having the same pattern. However, we didn't find any significant acoustic differences for creakiness, probably because very creaky tokens were already excluded from acoustic analysis. And also there's no one single acoustic measure that can characterize all kinds of creakiness. So we reverted to auditory judgment. We had someone not a native speaker of Cantonese, not knowing Cantonese at all, just listen to the production and judge whether the production sounded creaky or not. So we can see that for reference speakers, about half of the tone 4 tokens were creaky. But then if we compare that to children, we see very obviously that all children groups are significantly less creaky than reference speakers. So it's not that they were not creaky at all, just that the proportion of creaky tokens were still not on a par with adults. Okay, so quick summary. Only 2/3 of children and oldest group, they had production accuracy over 90%, but all groups, they perform significantly better than chance. Children can produce the major acoustic contrast similarly as adult very early on, but if we're looking at covert contrast and concomitant feature of creakiness, they find that very challenging. They haven't mastered that even at 6 years old. So with all this in mind, how do we define successful phonological acquisition? For this, we need to take our mind off acoustic data and look at something else. So are these cute babies walking? Clearly not, right? They are crawling on all fours. Then how about these 2? They are standing up with 2 feet, but are they walking? To some mothers, probably yes, but developmentally, this stage is still not walking yet. It is called cruising because they're walking with support. So what is the defining characteristic of walking? So let's have a quick look at this cute baby.
Let's go.
Okay, so that's walking. Why is it working? Because she didn't need to hold on to anything, and with her 2 feet, she had this locomotion. But if we compare her walking patterns with adults, she's still very wobbly and non-adult-like in many ways. There have been studies looking at walking gestures, and they said that adult-likeness in all aspects of walking not achieved until at least 7 years old. And if you're looking at finer motor control, maybe even 10. However, with such a criterion in mind, we probably would consider, would say that adult-likeness in all aspects may be unnecessary if we only rely on adult-likeness in all aspects. It's actually kind of counterintuitive. If we have this understanding for body gestures for walking, then actually similar patterns can be found in phonological acquisition as well. Munson and colleagues, they pointed out 2 aspects of successful phonological acquisition. First, the acquisition of productions need to be sufficiently adult-like to be perceived and transcribed as accurate, but not fully adult-like. There are other aspects. Development of adult-like speech motor control, assessed by acoustic or kinetic measures, would take much longer time to develop. They pointed out these useful aspects of phonological acquisition, but they did not mention how to define successful acquisition. So if we take their points, then we can say that tone acquisition is both early and late. If we take the first point, sufficiently adult-like to be transcribed and perceived accurately, then we can say that Cantonese students, they have reached that better than chance level at 2 year 1 month to 2 year 6 months already. However, if we are talking about fine motor control, covert contrast, then that is a very protracted stage of acquisition. They could not produce the covert contrast and concomitant feature even at 6. Production and perception accuracy also lacking behind reference speakers. Phonological and tone acquisition is in fact multifaceted. We can say it's both early and protracted. It depends on which aspect you are looking at it. I think it is unnecessary to insist on adult-likeness in all aspects. We need to take a more realistic approach, as long as they are using the contrast meaningfully. And what do we mean by meaningfully? A very simple definition, or not necessarily a definition, but a simple way to look at it would be, can they use the contrast better than chance? If they could do it better than chance in both production and perception, then I think we have very good evidence to show that they have the existence of these phonological categories. Fine motor control or covert contrast, concomitant features, all these will take more time to develop, but it doesn't mean that they're not using those categories meaningfully. Okay, so there's a very quick on first language acquisition of Cantonese tones, and then I move on to voice quality and Kunshan rule. Where is Kunshan? You see the dialectal map of China. Number 2 is the Wu speaking area. Kunshan is there, so next to Shanghai. We presented a poster yesterday. If you are interested, you can still go on to YouTube to watch the recording. Tone is multifaceted, not just relying on F0, but voice quality as well. Wu Chinese has retained interesting contrast from Middle Chinese, voicing contrast of initial obstruents, which is lost in most other Chinese dialects. However, it's not just whether the initial obstruent is voiced or voiceless. There is an interaction between voicing, tone register, and phonation. So let's have a listen.
Ga, 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 ga.
So register difference very obvious, but more than that, the vowel after voice consonants, they are breathy.
Ga, 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 ga.
Okay, so we had acoustic and EGG data, the acoustic data show that children, school age children, they could produce the low register tone with more noise and higher spectral tunes, showing that they could produce the vowels with more breathiness. Auditory judgment also confirm our acoustic patterns. So for school age children, we found that they could still distinguish this contrast. How about younger children? Well, we don't know because these children are very, very hard to find. However, the acquisition of tonal categories, pitch, and voice quality is not necessarily parallel and concurrent. There are different developments of these features. I don't have time to talk about that. If you're interested, you can watch the YouTube video. So move on to the second main point I would like to discuss, bilingual acquisition of tone. There have been very few studies on tone acquisition by bilingual children. A couple of studies showing that successive bilingual children, that means they had first Cantonese and then they were exposed to English, they had very few tone errors, but as expected because their Cantonese is developed first. Patterns for simultaneous bilingual, that means growing up with two languages, are still unknown. There was a case study, Light reporting on his own Cantonese speaking girl moving to the US. In his own words, he said that her she showed disintegration of her tonal system. Many of the errors resemble English stress or intonational patterns. So this study shows us that Cantonese tones can be influenced by English, but only data from one child, which is not enough. I had a study looking at successive bilingual children. A question to ask is, since there's no lexical tone in English, do they acquire tones later than their monolingual counterparts? That means, is there an acquisition delay? And also whether there is influence from English to Cantonese. I use all conversational corpus data. The bilingual data, I have 5 simultaneous bilingual children. They were children of mixed marriages, one parent, one language. Sampled at 2 time points, okay, 2-year-old and 2 years 6 months. And then I have monolingual data for comparison. At 2 years old, at 2 years 6 months, I had 10 Cantonese children, and then 3 children longitudinally tracking at 2 and 6 months. So I have 2 native Cantonese transcriber listening to all utterances, judging the production accuracy for each syllable. Again, 2 judgment criterion. Judge accuracy by 1 judge, that is the linear requirement. Correct production is, are those judged correct by both judges? That would be a more stringent criteria. So there's very high iterative reliability, over 90 for all data sets. If we look at overall accuracy rates, we can see that bilingual children, they are not lagging behind the monolingual children at both ages. If we look at individual tones at 2 years 6 months, the patterns are very similar. The green bars being bilingual children. I think it's fair to say they are on a par. If we look at earlier data, 2-year and 2-year-old, then maybe some tones, the monolingual children are doing better, but then conversely, you also see some tones that the bilingual children may be doing better. So there's not much obvious or consistent differences between the 2 groups of children. It would be more interesting to look at the individual patterns. So these are the data from the 5 bilingual children at 2 years and 6 months. You can see that Charlotte produced much less Cantonese because she was an English dominant child. If we use the linear criterion, then they are very much the same in terms of their accuracy. But if we use the more stringent criterion, then you can see that Charlotte was not as good as other bilingual children. And Llewellyn is also having a lot more errors than others. If we look at 2 years old, then you can see that both Charlotte and Llewellyn, they were not as productive in Cantonese and they had many more errors. So these two children would be interesting to look at. So this graph showing you their tone production accuracy when the syllable appear as the initial syllable of an utterance, in the middle position of an utterance, final position of an utterance, or as monosyllable. Citation tone, what it should be, and the judgment of the two raters. So if you see something very parallel, that means the two judges heard the production as the citation tone. So when the syllable appears as the left or the medial position, nothing very interesting. But when the syllable appears as the last syllable of an utterance, you see patterns that's quite striking. Many of the tone 1 syllables not heard as tone 1. Many of the tone, some of the tone 4 syllables. Many of the tone 4 syllables heard by rate 2 and R2 and R1, they were not originally tone 4. So what happened? We look at all the errors, the top 5 errors appearing with these words, and 61% of all the errors, they follow a trochee pattern. There's a high-low template. I can play you some of that. So go means big brother. Normally we say go, but then let's have a listen. Go. Okay, there's a high-low pattern. And then che car. Normally che. Again. Father che, mama che. Okay, father car, mother car, like that. Not che, but che. And then baby. Baby, like that. So very interesting. Okay, what should be high, they produce it as low. And looking at Charlotte as the final position, again, we see the citation patterns are not quite the same as those heard by the raters. So the top 5 errors, 4 of them are involved in templated errors. For Charlotte, in addition to the high-low template, we also have low-high. Okay, so this beautiful lang, it should be lang, but let's have a listen how she pronounces it. Ling. Even the research assistant was questioning what we're talking about ling like that. And then this guy means going out. She was playing a bit with this. Okay, let's have a listen. You heard the last one by the research assistant saying guy, that's the normal production, but Charlotte was saying guy, like that. So these templated errors, they're very similar to English stress pattern. They were found at 2 years old when these two children, they were less productive in Cantonese. The question to ask would be, would we see similar templated errors earlier at a younger age? So we push the timeline back for 3 months.
So I'm interested in the
1 year and
definitions
9
of
months.
association because
In
this,
addition to Charlotte,
the manipulation
another
of inducial stimuli in the associated condition
Alicia,
is not quite the same as.
Can everyone but
yes.
Peggy please mute your microphones? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alicia also not very productive in her Cantonese and she had more errors. And we were lucky to find similar templated errors. So this milk, it should be 99. She had correct production in the same recording. 99. But she also had something templated. 99. But it's not that she didn't know the correct production. She knew very well, but somehow in her speech, natural use of speech, she had this high-low template for some of the reduplicated words. And I was happy. I'm working on heritage children now as a new project. We also find similar templated production. So che, it should be is car. It should be like this. Che, and then che. Okay, and then flower. Fa. Now these production were from the same child, correct and incorrect in the same recording. So flower again. Fa fa correct. Fa fa. Okay, Highlow. Tong tong. Okay, so it's very interesting to find co-occurrence of both correct and incorrect production. So it's not that they have no knowledge of it, but clearly they are playing with the high-low pattern. So a quick discussion of this. I still have 1 point to go. So for bilingual children, we do see English influencing their Cantonese tones. The influence is realized as a high-low template. Such interaction is seen when the child was weak in Cantonese. Both tone and stress, they are of different prosodic aspects, but they use the same acoustic correlate, and that's probably why we see such interesting interaction. Okay, I need to move on. This is the part I really want to talk about, acquisition of complex tone sandy. There have been a number of studies on tone production, tone perception, tone acquisition, but they work on languages either without complex tones. For example, the Mandarin system, only 4 tones, not as complex on than other languages, or languages with more complex tone patterns like Cantonese, but Cantonese doesn't have tone sandy. So how about the acquisition of complex tone sandy patterns? It's a mostly uncharted territory. It is very interesting, but it's very challenging. It's very difficult to work on. There are a number of interesting questions that can be asked. Can children acquire both? How do they acquire both a complex tone system and tone sandy patterns together? Is tone sandy productive and learnable? And can a purely example-based account explain the acquisition patterns? Okay, the dialectal map of China again, and this time we look at number 4, the mean dialect area. You see that both in mainland China and Taiwan, they have people speaking Min. In Taiwan, they call it Taiwanese, and in mainland China, they call it Salmon. So essentially the same language. Okay, that's where Salmon is. So in Salmon, there are 5 free tones and 2 check tones. They all have sandy patterns. The tone sandy pattern in Salmon is right dominance. That means that in, let's say, a disyllabic word or in a multisyllabic sequence, the last syllable retains the citation tone. Everything else change. And for the 3 tones, there is this tone circle. You follow this pattern to change the non-final syllable. And for the check tones, it depends also on the final consonant. So let's have a listen. This duck meat. Okay. Okay. As the last syllable, so having the citation tone, when it is in a sequence, you can hear that this one is changed, okay, because it's not in the final syllable. There have been a number of studies looking at Taiwanese children saying that they have acquired the tones early with few errors, but then they use naturalistic corpus data. Because these sandy patterns would be the one they heard. They could produce sandy patterns. That's not too surprising. Being able to produce tone sandy doesn't necessarily mean that they have the abstract tone sandy patterns in mind. Maybe they just imitate the inputs. That's what quite a lot of researchers thought. Zhang and colleagues and some other researchers working on Taiwanese, that's what they propose. They say that tone sandy is not psychologically real. It is unproductive. So being able to produce them doesn't mean that you have the abstract tone sandy knowledge in mind. They are just remembering words. So tone sandy is lexically encoded allomorph listing. That's what they proposed. However, if we consider it from a different perspective, if tone sandy is not productive, what will happen to new words in the language? We have new words coming up all the time, and these words, they were not in the lexicon already. Would they have tone sandy or would they not have tone sandy? In addition to new words, we also have old words, and old words will become obsolete. That doesn't mean that tone sandy will be on decline. Zhang and others, they use accidental gaps in their experiments. But accidental gaps, they do not appear in real life. And the experimental designs they use, participants, they could skip meaning. They just repeat what they heard. Maybe such a design was not the most conducive for tone Sandy application. We also don't know how children perform in experimental tasks, and that's what our study was about. It was a master thesis by my previous student, published in Speech Prosody 2020. Okay, so we had both children and adults. The children, we divided them into two groups, older and younger children. These children, they are bilingual in Xiamen and Mandarin, and that's not something you can avoid because there's really no monolingual children, dialect speaking children already. So this is our materials. We have monosyllabic real words elicited by one picture. So such material give us the base tone. And then we have disyllabic words elicited by one picture. So they have the lexical item in mind. They know what it means. And then we also have disyllabic words elicited by two pictures. They need to do a combination task. Just looking at the pictures, they wouldn't get the real meaning. They need to combine them together in their mind, then they will understand what the word was intended to be. We had this D2 condition because our target materials will be these word words, semi-word words. We also have two pictures, real syllables, but then the resultant disyllabic word is not a meaningful word. And for D1 and D2, we have 18 overlaps to see whether there's an effect of the elicitation method. Okay, so for the monosyllabic words, we see very similar contours. There are some differences in terms of height, pitch height, but then generally the pitch patterns are very similar. So these children, they have no problem with the monosyllabic words. And there is no effect of elicitation method. Similarly, high accuracy rate for disyllabic words, whether you're seeing one picture or doing a combination in your mind. So monosyllabic words, disyllabic words, real words, high accuracy for all three groups, adult, older children, and younger children. For disyllabic words with two pictures, if we look at the citation position, that is the second syllable, ceiling accuracy. If we look at the Sandy position, that is the first syllable, we see a developmental pattern. Still, for the younger children, they are not too bad, over 80% accurate. But for the word words, our target materials, you can see that for citation tone, they're also at ceiling. But then for the Sandy position, much poorer performance. Even the adults were not at ceiling. So tone Sandy is still developing even for older children. If we look at the free tones versus the check tones, we see similar patterns, very clearly developmental trend. We have better accuracy for check tones because the Sandy patterns are simpler. When you have something so complicated, then you see younger children, they really didn't perform very well, even adults. Okay, so if they make errors, what kind of errors did they make? There are two main types, irrelevant tone. That means they produce something that is not related to the Sandy pattern. Okay, so this 5-3 should be produced as 4-4, but the child produced something else. More interestingly, will be the Sandy error. They either produce a citation tone in a Sandy position or they produce a Sandy tone in citation position, both related to these patterns. If we look at the actual counts and the percentages, something very noticeable. The majority of the errors are with the Sandy error, and not just in either position. Majority of the errors are the Sandy error in Sandy position. So the most common type will be Sandy errors in the Sandy position. That means the children, even the younger children, they know what the citation tone should be. They know the lexical tone, but they had trouble telling whether I should change or not change in a certain position. The strategy is, if you're not sure about position, preserve the citation tone. That's the safest bet. Okay, now this is a very, very interesting example of a child producing a word, not meaningful, just a number 6 and then a sock put together. The child starting off saying 6 in Mandarin, and then my student luring her back into Southern, and then she produced the citation tone correctly, and then in combination, first doing the Sandy correct, and then falling back into the citation tone, and finally one more time she did it correctly. Let's have a listen.
冇是個啦咩個字拜
Okay, so she was not sure. Her production was still a bit variable, but interestingly, her first instant was the correct one. And then she was not sure, changing it back. And finally, she did the right thing. So we see very high accuracy of tone sending application in real words, but clear developmental patterns in tone sending application and semi-one words. Tone sending is a higher order phonological process, also much slower in acquisition. How can they figure out the tone sending rules? I would argue that a purely exemplar-based model cannot explain the data well, but a hybrid model can. High-level phonological abstractions still not fully acquired by pre-teen children. We can say that phonological abstraction starts early, but can finish quite late, particularly if you have very complex patterns. Our data show that tone sending is learnable and productive, and they're not simply remembering from the input. Okay, so final conclusion, that's my last slide. I hope I have shown you that tone acquisition is great fun. I have a lot of fun working with children data. Tone is multifaceted, not just F0, voice quality as well, and not just tone, but interaction with other prosodic domains. There are many interesting questions to be asked. However, we need to act fast, particularly if you are working with Chinese dialects, because these dialect speaking children, they are just like big pandas, they're highly endangered. If nothing is done, then later on, we cannot really work on such interesting questions. So finally, I would like to thank my funding sources and my wonderful students for helping me into this fun area of tone acquisition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This microphone should be on, and yes, it is. There's already one question. Wen Tao, would you like to start?
Hi, Peggy.
Hi.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting and informative talk. Actually, I have many questions, but for the time, so I have two brief questions. One is for the acquisition of Cantonese tones. You know, there's already some tendency for some near tone merger even in the adults, but actually it's a kind of near merger. So some tones are merged in perception, but still differ in their production. So I wonder whether there's any impact of this near merger on the tone acquisition of the children. This is my first question. And the second is just some your study on Cantonese English bilingual tone acquisition. I think, of course, very interesting, but I'm more interested in those tone language, two-tone language, that is Cantonese, Mandarin, tone language, two-tone languages. For those kind of bilingual children, their pattern of tone acquisition may be more complex because the inference interaction between the two tone systems. Have you ever looked into this issue? Thank you.
Okay, now the first question, yes, indeed, there would be an impact. And actually my data on the mother's language kind of addressed that, but I didn't have time to report on this. However, even if you take into mother's language, whether it's standard or not standard, there's only a few % improvement in the production accuracy. So there's still a lot of the variance not explained by such factors. That's the short answer to your first question. The second question is, I didn't do anything on Cantonese Mandarin dialectal acquisition, but there have been a number of studies looking at that already. If you're looking at bidialectal acquisition, then you will be looking at more fine-grained differences. But when I look at Cantonese and English, the two systems are so different. So these prosodic campaigns are more obvious, and I think they are fun to work with.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Pilar is next, and I tried something new because I think that this cable might actually be long enough in this room. Yes, it is. You see?
Let's try. Oh, hello.
Yes.
You hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for this nice talk. I was really interested on the relationship between production and perception, because what happens with many studies that we're doing in L2 is that we even don't find a relationship, not even small or moderate, right? So in many studies now in L2 are really finding these, right? This lack of relationship. Then I was wondering whether you really need like a threshold of perceptual ability, because after all, there are different abilities, right? You need a threshold of our critical mass of perception ability to really start producing well, because that's at least for initial training of L2, people really recommend perception tasks, right? And it has been shown that it works. So my question is, did you analyze the correlations, longitudinally, whether, they were higher in when children are younger, or, also look at the critical issue, right? The threshold issue. Or what do you think in general about this? That's my question. Thanks.
I can answer this from two perspectives. One perspective is theoretically, I think you are right. Maybe their perceptual ability, they need to reach a certain proficiency before you see anything in the correlation. But then there's another aspect to it, very practical. If you have very young children, how do you measure their perception ability? And the data you get, whether it's really comparable with the production data, because with very young children, you don't really have a lot of production data for them. And I suspect the link between production and perception can be different for first language acquisition and second language acquisition. In second language acquisition, you have all sorts of possibilities. And there are studies reporting on whether there is a link, whether there's not a link, which one production first or perception first. And recently, even the SLM model has been revised to say that the perception accuracy may not precede production accuracy. The two, they can develop hand in hand. And even in first language acquisition, Marilyn Wieman, she also has a paper arguing that for children, first language acquisition, it is also possible for their production and perception accuracy to develop hand in hand.
And Peggy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much for the presentation. You mentioned at the end language endangerment and how many of these languages are being lost. I was wondering if you've noticed patterns of tonal attrition that go along with language endangerment, and whether there's any parallels between those and the patterns you've noticed in your bilingual children and the children that get fewer Cantonese input over time.
My data show that they were okay. Their tones were intact after a short period of time, so they could catch up. It depends a lot on their language dominance. But then for language endangerment, the situation in China now is not that the tones are disappearing. What's disappearing would be children speaking the dialect well enough. So if you don't really have children speaking it after a few decades, then it's really hard to work on acquisition again. I'm not sure whether I have answered your question.
Yes, he seems happy. Thank you. And here, the last short question, perhaps. Yeah.
Actually, then maybe I just skip, because I actually do have a long question, but I'm happy to skip, and I will contact Peggy later. Yeah.
I can leave the Zoom room open for you if you want, and we can move to the next Zoom room, and then you stay and discuss if you want. Okay.
Yeah, I can always talk to Peggy via email or other.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay to answer your question.
Yeah, that's also fine if you want. Yeah.
Thank you so much again, Peggy, for this wonderful keynote this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So Peggy, should I stay on? And
yeah, I will wait for you. Yes, let other people join other sessions first, then we can discuss.
Okay,
Yeah, so-
and we take 2-3 minutes break and move to the next session at 10:10 our local time. Thank you.
Yeah, so I actually, thanks for the talk. It's really data rich. I really enjoyed it and learning so much about the acquisition of tones. And I always feel that it's so important for us to know how kids acquire tones before we think too much about the theories of tone and representation processing. So here, first question that I have is really about this idea of psychological real or not. So, so what do you feel about this idea of linking tone sandy, psychological, real, unreal productivity? In the sense that if it's not productive, it's not psychological real anymore. So what do you think about this issue?
Well, first of all, I think it's quite obvious from my talk that I think tone sandy patterns are productive. Let's avoid the word whether it's psychologically real or not. It is productive. Children can learn it and they can apply it to new words. That's quite clear from my stance.
Mm-hmm. So then, oh, sorry to interrupt you. So
go on. Yeah, you ask the question first.
Yeah, because the productivity often is linked to computation. So in what sense do you mean by productive here?
That means they can apply the patterns to new materials, novel materials. In the literature working on tone sandy, there actually is quite a hot topic now. There are a number of studies looking at tone sandy productivity, but many of them, they just look at Mandarin. The patterns in Mandarin are very simple. It's really nothing compared to Southern Min or some other Chinese dialects. So the usual way of, or the usual research method would be you give them real words they can apply, and then you give them novel words or word words and see whether they are also applying such a pattern. If so, then the conclusion would be, yes, it is productive.
Yes, that I can understand. Then, so behind productivity, you could also have different mechanisms, right? So, but maybe I mean, we don't have to get into that, but I'm sort of trying to see whether you have any thoughts on that. And yeah, but maybe